Up next, we have Peter Fiekowsky. He is founder of the Healthy Climate Alliance. They're establishing explicit global climate goals of giving our children a healthy climate by 2050. He also was the founder of the Citizen Climate Lobby's 100-year plan group, which led to defining the goal of climate restoration. Please welcome Peter Fiekowsky.
Well, thank you for the welcome and the introduction. And a big thanks to Chip and Sally for organizing this program for 15 years. The leadership that they demonstrated is extraordinary and really inspiring. The title that was published for this talk was wrong. What I'm going to talk about is something that you probably have not even thought about, and that is restoring the climate. So the topic for this talk is we want to restore the climate, and climate restoration is the new policy goal. So I want to thank each of you for being here and for your commitment to restoring the climate. When you woke up this morning, you probably did not think that you were here to restore the climate. But at the end of this talk, I think you'll see that you are. So first of all, how many here have ever considered the term climate restoration before, even heard it? Great. So quite a few yes, and quite a few no. So I'm going to tell you that climate restoration is possible, it's feasible, and it's actually beginning to happen. I'm going to tell you about how we restore the climate and what we need to do to make it happen quickly by the year 2050. So a little introduction about myself. I'm a physicist from MIT. I have a software business in Silicon Valley, 27 patents in various kinds of image analysis. And as you heard in the introduction, 30 years experience of lobbying in Congress for poverty issues. And I got involved in climate restoration because we realized in our global poverty work that all the progress we've made, which is phenomenal, is going to go down the tubes if we don't restore the climate. So now, to look at what do we need to do, as a businessman, I like the analogy of when a business does poorly, sometimes a CEO will come in and say, our goal now is to not go bankrupt. And most of us, when we see a company with the goal of not going bankrupt, know that they're going to go bankrupt. And we always hope for a CEO to come in and say, I'm going to turn this around. We're going to ask, who's our customer? What do they want? And how are we going to give it to them? The next thing I'm going to say is a little distressing. In terms of climate, we went bankrupt 30 years ago. I think you all know that the level above the CO2 level that scientists have decided is above which we cannot go, above which humanity will not survive, is 350 parts per million. That number is repeated over and over again. We crossed that level 30 years ago, in 1988. We have been bankrupt since 1988, and we've been having a target. Our goal for the climate has been to not go bankrupt, yet we've been bankrupt. We've been trying to reduce emissions, but we already have way too much CO2 in the atmosphere. And now, of course, the Arctic is 80% melted. So I'm a physicist. I'm not really a turnaround expert, but for the moment, I'm going to pretend I'm a turnaround expert. And so the first question in turning a business around is, who is the customer? And the customer for the climate, we often think is nature, but really it's humanity. Because truly, nature will be fine whether or not humanity survives in the long term. Humanity, of course, won't be very good, won't survive at all, if we don't get the CO2 well below 350. And we're, of course, at 410 at this point. And what does humanity want? Well, it's pretty simple. We want our children to survive and our descendants to survive. And if it's too hot, the probability of survival goes down. If it's too cold, the probability of survival goes down. So we want that Goldilocks point. We want that point, that level of CO2, that temperature for the planet, at which is optimal for our species that we evolved for, that our species evolved for and our civilization evolved for. And that, we call that 300 parts per million. It's probably 270, but if we call it 300, the scientists don't argue. So we call it 300 parts per million or below. And if we want to do it for our children, we have to do it by 2050. And so our poetic target is getting to 300 parts per million by the year 2050. Now, we have methods for doing that, and I'm going to tell you about those methods in a moment. But as you probably know, those methods are not being pursued. They haven't been our goal. And last year, after we set the goal, I talked to the key scientists, including Klaus Lackner, who was here a few minutes ago, and asked, what methods do we have to get 1 trillion tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere? And there was always silence for a minute or two. But we said, well, that comes out to 50 billion tons a year. What can we do? Well, we came up with 8 different methods which could get the 1 trillion tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere by the year 2050. And every one of the scientists said, this is crazy. I've been doing this for 20 years, 30 years. No one has ever asked me if I could save the planet. How come you're just asking me now when it's too late? Well, it's not too late, but we've got work to do. It's a little bit like the Marshall Plan. After World War II, we didn't pretend that we were going to try to maintain Europe as it was. The Marshall Plan rebuilt it. We said, what do we want? How do we want Europe to be? And of course, we developed the European Union, and of course. Restoring the climate is going to be much the same thing. We get to rebuild and reinvent our planet for ourselves. Or not. That is to say, we could continue on our path to try to zero out emissions. That'll get us to about 450 parts per million. And I don't know what the life expectancy for humanity is at that level, but it's not very long. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but you can tell by my face that this isn't bad news. We have the methods to get out of this, and we will do it. So how do we do it? So we have to do 2 things. We have to get 1 trillion tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere, and we have to restore the Arctic ice. As you heard earlier, the Arctic is 80% melted. Think about that. 80% of the Arctic ice is gone. That means that in the summertime, when you have 24-hour sun, that sun is beating on a blue ocean and absorbing the heat, and it used to be white ice reflecting it into space. One way of restoring it is in the winter, when it's 24 hours dark and it's 50 below zero, you can pump seawater on top of the ice, and it will freeze. Anyone who's been up in Canada or Minnesota knows that you can freeze it very quickly. Once you've added a meter of ice, just a meter of ice, that's enough to last the whole summer. And so it's not rocket science. In fact, that technique has been done for 50 years. The oil companies use that to build islands for their projects, for drilling rigs and so on. And so it's been mastered. The difference is that we would use windmills. We would use wind turbines to power it rather than diesel engines. So that's doable. And it's been pursued at Arizona State University, and I want to really thank Arizona State for their leadership. Stephen Desch wrote a phenomenal paper on this last year, got a lot of publicity. Now, the support he's gotten, I asked him how much he spent on this last year. Less than $15,000, because it's not our goal yet. And so you can see where this is going. There's a little bit of work that people here can do. Another method of restoring the ice is what's called floating sand. You can take very fine sand, melt it into hollow glass beads, which float, and spray it over the ice. And it only needs a 1/3 of a millimeter layer. And when the ice melts in the springtime, because it's warm, the melt pond now has a white layer, which reflects the sun, like it's snow. And so the modeling and testing has shown that can preserve the ice through the summer. And their modeling says that most certainly we can restore the Arctic ice by 2050. My hunch is that they're being conservative because they're conservative scientists, and probably well before that. But we'll call it 2050. Interesting. So carbon dioxide removal. How do we remove 1 trillion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere? We've heard a lot of talks in the last 3 or 4 days about carbon dioxide removal. And I'm going to ask you to set those aside for the moment, because that has been carbon dioxide removal with a purpose of mitigating, of zeroing out our emissions. of trying to hold our CO2 to 450 or below, which is way above the 300 above which humanity has ever lived before. Think about that. Humanity has lived through climates of 300 parts per million, and we're targeting 450. So set aside your old thinking on carbon dioxide removal and be with me as an entrepreneur for a minute. If you've ever started a business, and especially if you're technological, you have a really great product idea. But you learn, and I've got 27 patents, you learn very quickly that a great idea is of no use unless you have a market. And so when we're removing 1 trillion tons of CO2, we have to ask, where's the market for that 1 trillion tons of CO2? Because if there's not a market, it's not going to happen. And just for example, the Global Thermostat gave us these great movies a couple days ago. And their market is to replace fossil fuels. It's a great market, but of course that doesn't restore the climate. So, so what can we do? Well, we're going to do carbon dioxide removal both on land and in the ocean. On land, what you do is mineralization. It's a little bit of a surprise to most people. So you convert CO2 into minerals, primarily limestone, and the process is essentially what shellfish, what clams do. And in Silicon Valley, we have a company called Blue Planet, and they're looking for investors, by the way. You can ask me, I'll give you the information. And they take CO2, mostly from power plants, but also they can take it from the atmosphere, and calcium, and they make limestone. And this limestone is ideal, is the exact same limestone used in aggregate for making concrete. Now what's amazing is globally we use 50 billion tons a year of concrete, and that's going up 6% per year. And it just so happens that to get back to 300 parts per million or below of CO2, we need to remove 50 billion tons a year of CO2. The limestone is almost half CO2 by weight. And that means that over a period of 30 years, we could actually remove, if we converted all of our concrete usage, all the aggregate for concrete and roads, and made it out of CO2, we could get all 1 trillion tons out of the atmosphere. And it's profitable, because it turns out that the cost of aggregate isn't the cost of mining it, it's the cost of shipping it. And as you well know, the wind blows. So wherever you need the aggregate, you can actually manufacture it in place, and it's then cost competitive. In California, we got laws passed which simply says that when you're building a highway, you have to use the lowest carbon aggregate and concrete available. And so it doesn't take much to have this be pretty much universal. So that's what we can do on land, and it's profitable. And in the ocean, it's very interesting. The ocean, as you well know, is 3/4 of the area of our planet. And you want to do photosynthesis there. You're not going to do mineralization in the ocean. Just like you don't want to use a lot of photosynthesis on land, because we want to grow crops. We want to have our beautiful forests. We don't want to harness all of that for something else. But photosynthesis in the ocean, when I was in 7th grade or 8th grade, my biology teacher, Mr. Cross, told me, and I'm a physicist, I wasn't really listening, but and it wasn't just because Bill Nye was my classmate and my lab partner. And if any of you can connect me to Bill Nye, I still want to talk to him. Yeah, I was told that what it takes for photosynthesis is air. I'm sorry, my mind just went away. Is sunshine, water, and nutrients, and we need to get the nutrients out of somewhere in the ocean. It either comes from the air as dust or upwelling from below. And we have methods that duplicate the dust and other methods that duplicate the upwelling. Now, what's really interesting is it doesn't take very much, because, as you know, the ocean is sick, but it's not all that sick. And the methods and when you do either of these methods, you can then sell fish, you can sell fishing rights. With the upwelling, the preferred way to do that is to grow kelp, and kelp can be sold. It happens to be by far the most efficient photosynthesis method on the planet, and you can sell the kelp and the fish. So now we have 3 methods, any 1 or 2 of which could do the whole trillion tons, and you did not know about that, unless you talked to me already. So what's it going to take? So what it's going to take is a goal. And when in my car, I have cruise control, and there's no setting on the cruise control that says don't get a ticket. So if I want to not get a ticket, I have to set it to something, and I usually set it to 65, and I don't get tickets. In the same way, globally, we need to shift our goal from avoid disaster, because there's no setting for avoid disaster. The setting is restore the climate, get back below 300 parts per million by the year 2050. And let's see. And so things are actually beginning to happen. As I told you, there's a little bit of work at the ASU on the ice thickening. There's work in Barrow right now on the sand. There is a little bit of progress on the ocean work. And the thing about the ocean work, people worry about, oh my God, the ocean. But think of it as farming. A farmer would never do one process for the whole country or even his whole farm. He divides it into pastures, into fields. And naturally in the ocean we have to do the same thing. You pick a region and provide the nutrients and monitor the results. Make sure that the fish are healthy. If the fish aren't healthy, you know you're doing it wrong. And the good news is you have do-overs, just like on a farm. If the fish get sick or something, or they don't restore as you want, then you change the formula and do it again. The fish will come in when you fix the system. So we have on-the-ground progress happening. At the same time, we've been working with the UN, with the Vatican, and with Congress. We have RAND Corporation came out with the first ever paper discussing climate restoration. We can, and the paper says, is restoring the climate an appropriate policy goal? And the answer is, of course it is. That had never been asked before, but is now in the scientific literature, and so it can be discussed in public. So our job is to make it permissible to discuss climate change, to discuss climate restoration. So the main thing that we can do here is talk about it. And so I just want to invite you to say with me, climate restoration. We want climate restoration. Okay, a little louder so that they can hear it at the UN. Okay, good. So that's the main job for this year. That our target by the end of the year is when people hear climate, they think climate restoration. That's where we're going. That's the gift we're giving to our children. We want it. We can do it. And we will do it by the year 2050. Thank you.